Welcome to everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome today Patrick Patterson, who will speak on his 2011 book, Bought and Sold, Living and Losing the Good Life in Yugoslavia, published with Cornell University Press. And I should say we're pleased to welcome Patrick back, since he is an alum of the history department here at Michigan. He did his dissertation work with John Fine and Raymond Grew, among others. Patrick has a varied and interdisciplinary background. Before coming to Michigan to study history, he took a BA in religion at Princeton. He then earned a law degree at the University of Virginia and practiced for 6 years before returning to academic life and turning to history. And his work has been recognized and sponsored by a wide range of prestigious fellowships from places that include the ACLS, IREX, and Fulbright, among others. Now, Patrick is a historian of Yugoslavia in the truest sense of the word. He has published articles on a wide range of topics and areas of successor states, we could say, within the former Yugoslavia. He's published on topics that include Balkanism and debates about Balkanism in Austria, Italy, and Slovenia, on journalism and the independent press in Slovenia, particularly on Mladina. He has looked at the legacies of Ottoman rule in Croatia and Bosnia. He has written on Islam and Christianity, not just in the Balkans, but in the New Europe and what he calls the New West. He's looked at tourism, advertising, and marketing in socialist Yugoslavia. Now, I bring this up not only to stress his wide scholarly range, but also because I think it's important to note that many scholars of the Yugoslav lands, particularly those of Patrick's generation who began their work or carried out most of their work after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, tend to focus or have expertise on just one of the successor states. Even when they write on Yugoslav topics, they tend to be ultimately, someone who is really a Croatia person or a Slovenia person or a Bosnia person. And I think it's really important to note that Patrick has resisted this kind of narrowing of expertise. And I'm talking primarily about scholars not from the region. But he's really resisted that. And I think even more unusually, he embeds Yugoslav topics in comparative discussions. And this is really most evident in the work that he has been doing on consumer culture and about which he will speak today. There in Bought and Sold, Patrick carefully weighs what was unique to the Yugoslav experience, and at the same time, what Yugoslav consumerism shared with other socialist as well as capitalist societies. In Bought and Sold, Patrick actually tests and evaluates a number of common assumptions that you hear about Yugoslavia, but which often really haven't been interrogated. And this is incredibly important about this new book. One of these theses or commonplaces is that the regime permitted and even facilitated a version of capitalist style, I put that in quotes, but capitalist style consumerism in order to divert citizens' energies away from political opposition and to create the grounds for political legitimacy. And Patrick investigates this assumption on a number of levels. First, he examines debates in Yugoslavia about both the promises and perils of consumerism, and he goes into great depth in the book about this. Secondly, he gives us a genealogy of advertising in socialist Yugoslavia that really demonstrates the struggles of its practitioners to provide the profession with legitimacy. And he looks at and demonstrates the very careful and assiduous work of individuals in the advertising industry to promote and valorize both their profession and its ultimate object, which was consumption. Finally, he discusses consumption at the level of everyday life, contending that ordinary Yugoslavs participated enthusiastically, for the most part, in pursuit of what he calls the Yugoslav good life, and which I expect we will hear more about today. So in advancing this kind of analysis, Patrick makes a very powerful case both for the uniqueness of Yugoslavia in the socialist world, but also for its relevance as an example that enables scholars to interrogate assumptions about the necessary and inevitable links between capitalism and consumerism, for example. As he does this, Patterson demonstrates the significance of Yugoslavia far beyond area studies. And he gives us a work that has truly broad interdisciplinary appeal. And I think this is an incredibly important lesson and model for all of us in a moment when Slavic studies and area studies are under threat, right? And we're continually questioned about the relevance of our fields. So Patrick's work is very, very powerful in this way. So I think without further ado, I will turn it over to Patrick, who we are very pleased to welcome, and we thank you in advance for sharing your research with us.
Thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Pam Ballinger, Penny Von Eschen for having me here, to Nicole Housen and Donna Parmalee for helping me get here. And then speaking of Donna, that gets me to another topic. All the people who mattered so much to me when I was here. Donna is one of the people who made sure that I had a home here from the very beginning. It is great to be back here. I'm going to try not to get a little emotional. All right. You don't want to get choked up right at the beginning of your talk, but I'm just deeply grateful to be back at the University of Michigan. I am reminded, just walking around in the 30-degree weather that I don't have in San Diego, just how important this place was to me, just how much a home it was to be around people like John Fine, Ray Grew, who meant so much to me, Brian Porter, with whom I studied, Zvi Gittelman. Michigan is an unusual place where there is so much weight, so much attention, so much energy, so much enthusiasm on the places that we all care about and the stuff that all gets us excited and the questions that we're trying to come up with answers to. It's terrific to be back here. I appreciate it. My book, Bought and Sold, tells the story of something that, simply put, was not supposed to happen. Socialist states were not supposed to become consumer societies. Obviously, a concern for the satisfaction of material necessities was at the core of Marxist thought, and Marxist-Leninist ideology and practice had no problem at all contemplating the development of manufacturing capacities that would result in vastly improved living standards. But we weren't supposed to see consumerism. That is to say, socialism was not supposed to cause the symbolic, the expressive, the cultural value of the goods and the services that were purchased to end up supplanting what Marx had identified as their real use value, what they were good for to produce things with. Prosperity and social welfare were the goal, but they weren't supposed to end up letting a huge variety of consumer desires and wants to be substituted for what the socialists considered to be a much more limited and constrained set of genuine human needs. So this account is an effort to make sense of the fact that these things could and did happen in socialist society. And they happened with what I conclude were very far-reaching implications for the ordinary people who made up those societies and for the communist governments that led them. Yugoslavia is the case that demonstrates that fact most clearly and most robustly. In some respects, the Yugoslav experience is exceptional, something that we might expect given the independent course that the country took with a break with Stalin in 1948 that took it out of the Soviet bloc, followed by that move toward self-management socialism, their phrase, beginning in 1950, which sought to put ownership and control of factories and of other productive capacity in the hands of the enterprise's workers themselves, and move it away from that centralized, top-down state ownership and planning model that was known as the command economy. Those choices to let Yugoslavia be different, to let it be different, certainly do matter in the story that we have here. The creation of the consumer culture that I describe in Bought and Sold, and the freedom with which that culture of consumption was marketed to ordinary consumers, and the enthusiasm with which it was eagerly snapped up by citizens. Precisely the ways, in other words, in which it was bought and sold, made Yugoslavia in the end something unlike any other socialist country. But ultimately, Yugoslavia doesn't stand completely apart. Quite to the contrary, I'd argue that there are important common dynamics shared with other socialist societies. And this is something I hope we can get into in more detail in the question and answer period that comes later. And that this consumerist reorientation really has to be understood in comparative terms as well, as central to the historiography, our academic understanding of the larger socialist experiment as it's unfolded not just in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, but in places like China, like Vietnam, Nicaragua, even today, Cuba. One of the things I want to concentrate on here today is to show you how the expansion of consumer culture was something that was understood at the time to be a matter of tremendous concern, something worth worrying about, something worth trying to understand, something worth fighting against, and also, perhaps surprisingly, something that Yugoslav citizens loved so much they thought it was worth fighting for. Then I want to look at how those controversies themselves connect with the broader historiographical conceptual issues that I just mentioned. In other words, I want to show you how the creation of what I call the Yugoslav dream of consumerist abundance mattered in bigger ways for the history of the socialist multi-ethnic federation, for the history of socialism in Eastern Europe and beyond, and more generally for the history of consumption, of business, of capitalism, of markets in their broadest sense. And before I get into any of that, I want to try and acquaint you with, as well as I can in the short time we have here, with the day-to-day realities of Yugoslavia's consumer culture. That is, to give you a sense of just what it was that was giving the critics such headaches and causing all this controversy. First, then, some very quick background. It's important to recognize that economically and culturally, Yugoslavia was undergoing a remarkable transformation in the decades after World War II. In both absolute and relative terms, living standards, purchasing power were rising at a tremendous rate. The story that I have to tell focuses mostly on the 60s and 1970s because those are the years of the hottest and most dramatic change, but we really can see that change beginning as early as the 1950s. It was present on the ground all over the country, and it was something that ordinary Yugoslavs were talking about constantly, often with a great sense of pride. And while there were very noticeable differences between the richer and the poorer regions of the country, the cities and the towns, the change was all the more important, I believe, for the extent to which it did manage to affect virtually all parts of the Yugoslav Federation. The vision of consumerist abundance that I call the Yugoslav dream was remarkable precisely because it became a model for the country as a whole. It really was a Yugoslav dream. That's certainly how it got sold, and that's how it got bought, too. So far, so good. Well, what was the problem then? To give you a better sense of just why the subject of consumer culture would end up generating so much controversy, I want to show you a little sample of the kinds of advertisements and images of the good life that ordinary citizens in Yugoslavia were seeing on a regular basis by the 1960s and 1970s, and we're beginning to see in the 1950s. A series now of 3 slides that suggest how various Yugoslav manufacturers and their advertising creators could go about the same task, in this particular case trying to sell a washing machine in very different ways at precisely the same historical moment. The first of these is an advertisement from 1969 for the super automatic washing machine manufactured by a large Croatia-based enterprise, Castor Rade Končar. There's a delicious little irony here because Rade Končar factory is one of the places where Tito, as a young communist labor organizer, learned to do what he learned to do so well. And now they're doing this. What jumps out immediately about the ad itself is that it's almost completely free of text. It just relies on the image of the attractive, fashionably dressed young woman, smiling, leaning against the machine, looking up alluringly, legs splayed out to one side. They had to work really hard to get her legs showing. Right? This is a very, very staged, this is not a natural pose. Right? It's a consciously created advertising message. And it gives you a sense of just how far Yugoslavia's advertising specialists had gone by the end of the 1960s, in departing from any kind of serious notion of a new genre of distinctively socialist advertising that was supposed to be primarily about providing information, about raising standards of taste for the nation, about educating the public honestly about the qualities and the uses of the product. There's very little of that going on here. The second advertisement, likewise from 1969, shows a group of handsomely dressed children playing in front of a bunch of household appliances, all of them plunked down in a very sunny, leaf-strewn clearing among some birch trees, a setting that is incongruous, doesn't make much sense, but it's indisputably attention-grabbing. The two little girls are happily playing in pots and pans on a toy stove, shown, as it were, in training for their future gender roles, while the little boy stands off to the side with his hands in his pockets, more than a little bit detached from it all, perhaps shown, as it were, in training for a future gender role. The vision is one of reassuring prosperity, of idyllic order, of domestic and familial contentment, of children being raised the right way, and not least of all, of tradition being blended with this very confident sense of progress and modernity, nature and industry. The manufacturer of these appliances, the prominent Slovenian firm Gorenje, whose products were highly sought after all across communist Europe, and now today more widely across Europe, promises in this ad modern production from a modern factory for a modern home for your home. Finally, we come to the third ad, also from the same time, 1969. Like the other two images, this one, you like it when somebody in the audience says, "Whoa!" Okay, that's a good sign. This effort to sell washing machines removes the appliance from its setting in the home, the actual site of the housework. Instead, we see the machine floating over the surface of the beautiful blue sea. This is a very bizarre pairing, I will admit, but it's something that's not accidental. It's something that people who would live there would immediately recognize as evoking the Adriatic, and therefore as evoking the quintessential Yugoslav imagery of free time, of leisure. The viewer is immediately supposed to be thinking, that's where we all go on vacation. The washing machine advertised here is the product of the Obod factory in Montenegro. Yugoslavs themselves like to think of Montenegro as a notoriously wild and backward kind of place. Even Montenegrins have embraced that. Montenegro's tourism slogan today for the entire country is Montenegro, experience wild beauty. All right? It's an image that is a source of some pride. Cetinje, the old traditional capital of Montenegro, is not exactly the kind of place, if you've been there, it's a sleepy little town. It saw its best days by the 19th century. It's not the kind of place from which you would expect to see emanating a powerful message about modernity. But it is precisely the place from which you see that kind of message about socialist modernity coming. Like the other ads you just saw, and like so many ads that I reviewed, not just from Yugoslavia, but now in the course of a comparative book that I'm writing from Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the GDR. This one traffics in very strong gender roles, something that in fact formed a very central problematic for the societies of socialist Europe as they set about trying to reconcile, on the one hand, Marxist egalitarianism and the sheer need for women's labor, and for women to help support their families, with, on the other hand, the persistence of what were often highly traditional, and in some parts of Yugoslavia, even frankly and unapologetically patriarchal, attitudes about women's roles. In this advertisement, we see critically, not just the machine, but what the machine promises the new Yugoslav working woman. The text tells us that the Obod machine is just the model that, quote, the woman who wants a washing machine dreams about. It will, readers are promised, and again I'm quoting, give laundry the whiteness that women want so much. The text arguably is less important than the visual elements, I would say. In each of the 6 little images below, we see the lucky purchaser of the machine, or maybe she's the recipient of the machine. She's blonde, young, stylish. Her makeup is always perfect throughout the day. She is liberated from the drudgery of laundry, and as a result, she is enjoying time to get her hair styled, to work in an office setting, to do a little pleasure reading, and at the end of the day, to wind up dancing happily in her husband's arms. Last image. 2 other photos make it clear to us that she will also have the time to get a little cleaning and cooking done along the way. This machine then clearly offers her a liberation within her role as a modern Yugoslav working woman. Not anything even resembling emancipation from that role. She still ends up having to do it all. And this sort of message was by no means uncommon. If you think about the dominant images of the communist marketplace that have traditionally circulated, bleak and gray and choiceless, then it's perhaps more surprising that the three Yugoslav examples I just showed you from three very different republics all appeared as full-page ads in the very same issue of one publication. There's a real choice here. This is from the very popular house and garden magazine called Naš Dom, Our Home. Here's an example of covers of that from 1969. You can see here that the father is bringing home a stove that is not in a box, as it really would be, and he's bringing it home in the family car, and he's bringing it home to a detached single-family home that is quite likely brand new. As you can see, it's obviously right at the edge of a suburban development, open fields right behind it. The editors of this magazine were sending out some very, very interesting signals about what the good life was supposed to look like. Like so many of its counterparts, this Yugoslav magazine, Naš Dom, proved to be a major conduit for advertisers' efforts to shape a new consumer consciousness. And it positioned itself not just as a monitor of style and fashion and taste, but as an arbiter, as a shaper of style and fashion and taste as well. And perhaps just as importantly, though less obviously, it served as a promoter too. The editors and the art designer for this cover shot clearly didn't want readers to see a boring old cardboard box. They wanted people to see the exciting new stove. They made sure you saw that. What I'm suggesting here is they were constantly working with industry, celebrating consumption in the media. The received stereotypes from the Cold War have taught us to see socialist everyday life as drab and devoid of style. But what I've discovered is that specialists in these cultural industries of advertising, design, fashion, mass media, they were working very hard to stay abreast of the times, to present a constantly updated and refreshed vision of modern living. To these people and to the public, the latest styles mattered, as you can see from the very radically different visuals of this issue from 1977, just 8 years later. Another whoa, okay? Okay, so maybe I shouldn't admit this, but I love the 1970s. I am a child of the 1970s and a creature of the 1970s, so I hope at least some of you dig the 1970s as much as I do. In any case, love it or hate it, it's all there. The wicker, the sisal mats on the floor, the houseplants that we all had back then hanging there in the back, the platform shoes, lots and lots of yellow molded plastic. It's not in the picture, but you've got to think there's some kind of macrame plant hanger in there in that room somewhere. And if you lived in the 70s, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a transnational style. Available to Americans, it triggers American memory. Yugoslavs participating in it as well. But though it might not be apparent, I would argue that there's really a connection between this sort of style and macroeconomic policy. With the contractions that hit Eastern Europe hard toward the ends of the 1970s, it became much more difficult to stay in fashion. And that's why so much of the socialist world ended up looking to Western eyes so comically outdated. The previous era of expanding consumption became economically unsustainable in the 80s, and they got stuck in that period of bright red and lime green and orange and yellow molded plastic. There just wasn't the money to keep on going with the constant updating of fashion and style throughout the country. To come at this another way, let me take you quickly through a representative set of ads for the stuff that was going in these machines. A selection of laundry detergent ads from this period taken from Svijet, one of the country's leading women magazines, published in Zagreb in Croatia and read around the country. And this is from a time, by the way, 1968, when one commentator remarked that, quote, "Our average Yugoslav woman has a lot of temptations. Every month, a new detergent." So let's look at how it gets done. This is from 1962, an ad for Time detergents. Pretty simple message. Time for your laundry whitens clothes. Very bold graphics, clearly drawing on a kind of international advertising style, international advertising conventions. Even the brand name suggests something international, specifically a kind of Anglo-US influence, Time. And the idea that time can be saved and time can be sold in a box through the automatic washing of laundry. In this one, More decontextualized washing machines, this time used to sell the detergent. It's an image of abundance, a kind of wild proliferation of options, of choice. It doesn't matter, says the ad, what kind of washing machine you own. We have the right detergent. But we realize you have so many different options. As we all know, Melos Aid laundry is nicer, right? Right? This was a very vexing ad. From what in the world is Melos Aid laundry? What is melizirano? I looked and looked and looked and looked. I searched for cognates in other languages. I'm trying to figure out what would that be in Czech? What would that be in Slovak? Meliziran in German. No, why not? Finally, I figured out. They made it up. They're advertising people. They made it up. It's and after the fact, I found somebody commenting on how amusing it was that we made up this word melizirati to give this idea of a process that whitens and softens your clothes. So how soft and white it is. It's been washed with Mixal, which melizates it. Melizated laundry is nicer. Okay. Finally. An appeal to science, to rationality. We have the guy in the white coat down there at the bottom, the expert scientist. But we've also got, he's subordinated visually to the salesman in the striped jacket and just in case you didn't know, he's got with a Biomat button on top. The experts, we've got experts, we've got scientists with bubbling beakers, because a classic image of chemical knowledge in the 1960s and 1970s. We have energetic promotion with quiet authority in the background. And the claim that this is what all the Yugoslav housewives that we surveyed and interviewed were asking for. This is what the greatest experts at Zlatorog, the company, created on the basis of many years of scientific research. So these ads, I think, tell us a lot. We've got a real sense of change over time, increasing sophistication, emulation of Western standards, technical standards, production values, composition techniques, Western appeals, and a variety of messages, too, a variety of appeals to novelty, to what's new and improved, to innovation, to practicality, to rationality, to science, but also to emotion, to envy and jealousy. In this ad here, there's the idea that these women are very, very concerned. You can see the look on their faces. Just what has she been able to pull off to get this man? And then at the bottom, it's a series of images how from woman to woman, the secret of Melos Aid laundry is transferred. So there's envy, jealousy, sex, getting and keeping your man. It's all there. Finally, let me show you a few examples of advertising that demonstrate just how far away the Yugoslav ad industry, and for this communist country, unlike the others, it really is fair to call what we're talking about an industry. Just how far away these ad specialists ended up from the ideal of an imagined socialist advertising that was supposed to inform customers, build communist values. Here, if the Hungarian social critic Elemer Hankish, speaking about the post-socialist period and modern conditions more generally, talks about consumerism, that sort of values that you are what you buy, as offering the promise, what he calls it is the toothpaste of immortality, right? You buy this product and it's going to connect you with the good life reliably. It's going to take you to where the excitement is, the toothpaste of immortality. The critics in Yugoslavia would have agreed with that. What I can tell you is that if they weren't selling the toothpaste of immortality, they were absolutely selling Rouge Uspiecha, the lipstick of success. That's what it says right there, the lipstick of success. In this ad for BB, Brigitte Bardot Cosmetics, with the sex symbols name used as the brand name, sold under license from a Slovenian company. So again, sexualized imagery, with the use of a Western international sex symbol. The advertising specialists had studied sex in the ads. If you look at the advertising journals, you'll see very conscious attention to how to sell sex, relying on studies. This was a time when Freud mattered a lot, and things like phallic symbols. All right? They were looking at ways to include that kind of imagery in the ads. Plays directly also to the movie star culture, an international movie star culture that mattered tremendously in Yugoslav popular culture. You see it all over the mass media in Yugoslavia. In this one, we have another set of very modest informational claims down here at the bottom. With our newest models, you're going to get extraordinary comfort and an attractive figure, but they really leave it mostly to the visuals. And yes, there is the information of what the bra looks like, but it really is an appeal to beauty here, but not just beauty, to luxury as well. Right? Look at those earrings. We're pretty far away from the kind of standard stereotyped images of drab socialist life. And in this one, for million look shirts, the shirts that will make you look like $1 million. The shirt with all the advantages. And again, the man wrapped in the arms of the woman, and look at the jewelry on her. Right? So much jewelry. She's got her pearls in her mouth. Right? We are very, very, very far away from a kind of prescribed socialist advertising. So while there's abundant evidence that many Yugoslav citizens ended up loving the consumer culture that was exploding all around them, and this truly was a popular culture that they themselves were building with their own actions and decisions. For some during the socialist period, including some people who had real political power, a culture based on images and values like these most definitely was threatening. So I want to direct your attention now to that resistance, to the very revealing controversies that erupted all around this heady pursuit of the good life. Those debates could get very ugly and hot and quite rancorous. An interesting point here is, however, that given how sharp the attacks were, the relative absence of declarations and directives from the highest levels of the party is quite noteworthy. Tito himself was remarkably silent on these subjects, and when he did talk, he often qualified his remarks with a bit of indulgent apologetics for it all. But if people in the Politburo circles seem to be willing enough to look the other way, the criticism from others in the party could prove extremely harsh. Here, let me give you just one memorable example from a media fracas in 1973, when Yugoslav communist Voja Vukicevic used the party's official newspaper, Communist, as a platform to rail against the emergence of commercial promotion as what he termed, quote, an advertocracy. In other words, a system of profit-driven psychological manipulation, fundamentally antipathetic to self-management, socialism, one that was, as he put it, and I'm quoting here, a special force for managing people's desires and dispositions. Advertising, Vukicevic claimed, functioned as a method of psychological torture, and that's the word he used, torture, designed to reshape the desire and the will of ordinary citizens to dupe them into needing things they really didn't need. As a result of their constant subjection to irrational and deceptive advertising messages, Vukicevic asserted, people were now frequently becoming slaves. Again, that's his word, slaves. Slaves to the products they consumed. Advertising, it was said, was creating all sorts of false needs. Here's how he assessed the situation. Again, a quote. Under the pressure of everyday life and the desire to stay in step with the times, individual products become items you just can't do without. Under the pressure of the advertocracy, people will strive to use only those goods that are up to date, even at the cost of sacrificing other elementary material or spiritual needs. So that line of attack that you just heard obviously shares a lot in common with critiques of consumer society that were articulated by Western theorists, Western critics, like Jean Baudrillard, economists like Thorstein Veblen, John Kenneth Galbraith, critics of advertising like Vance Packard, the sort of old classics, all of whom were producing analyses with which, I think it bears noting, these Yugoslav critics were familiar. They were reading that Western critical literature. They were incorporating it into their own diagnosis of socialism. Vukicevic himself argued that there were some further dangers. Specifically, this advertocracy was busily generating its own philosophy and ideology, ideas that he, like a lot of others, saw as intruding constantly into every area of interpersonal relations and especially into culture. It seemed that in socialist Europe, advertising and marketing and retailing mattered because it was now the creators and purveyors of commercial promotion who were starting to replace artists as the shapers of culture. They were becoming, to use Stalin's famous phrase, the engineers of human souls. And maybe the advertocracy was winning at the time. I was amazed to find another critic, sociologist in the Marxist tradition, who was otherwise in the business, in the process of offering a really harsh diagnosis of what he called the imitation of Western consumerism. Imitation. Turning around and actually exempting a whole range of consumer items as he did that. Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, refrigerators, gas and electric stoves, radios, televisions, even cars. These, quote, needs of our people, and I'm using his words, needs of our people just yesterday were on the other side, but today they're on this side of material necessity. They had become, and I'm quoting here again, quote, almost essential for the normal course of work and life. And that kind of indulgent stance, I think, reveals how many observers, and among them even some of the most committed opponents of consumerism, were themselves starting to find much of what constituted mass consumption associated with Western styles to be quite normal, quite natural. Well, that was absolutely not the case for members of another group of critics who tended to be outside the circles of communist authority. They were committed Marxists, but they were identified with an aggressively egalitarian, academically oriented, anti-market revisionism that has to be understood as part of a much larger, internationalized, new left sensibility that also really did bridge the Cold War divide, something that was shared with the West. In nonconformist Yugoslavia, debate over cultural issues was often considerably more open than in other communist countries. By the 1960s, at least, it was easier to be a nonconformist among the nonconformists. And that had big implications for the controversy over consumer culture and the Yugoslav dream. Most notably, a group of critics gathered around the influential left-wing journal Praxis repeatedly expressed their very jaundiced view of the course of recent events. As the post-war era unfolded, modern life in the developed West presented all these Marxist revisionists with a dilemma. And much of that dilemma was wrapped up in consumerism. The problem was this. In a number of ways, the post-war rise of the West clearly looked better than life under actually existing socialism. More affluent, more comfortable, more free. The critique that came from these quarters betrays some discomfort in front of those difficult facts, but members of the circle were able to argue, quite deftly I think, that what the West seemed to promise was really simply hollow. The comfort was transitory. The freedom was illusory. The wealth, ultimately quite costly. In the end, however, this kind of analysis didn't deny that for those who wanted to bring about a socialist revolution, or in the Yugoslav case, for those who wanted to preserve one, the advent of modern consumerism had changed the rules of the game. So as the Croatian writer Rudi Supek put it, the mass media of some socialist countries, and especially Yugoslavia, had quickly oriented themselves toward the logic of the market and considered themselves progressive if they began to develop their readers' taste for West European consumer society. Consequently, and I give you Supek's words again, everything reminiscent of Marxism soon disappeared from their pages. New values appeared: sensationalism, pathological forms of social behavior, eroticism, pop music, fashion snobbery, nude models on new models of automobiles, everything that would appeal to the petit bourgeois parvenu. These are not nude models, but they're close. You can see this is one ad from Naš Dom. From the Slovenian version of that. It was published in both Slovenian and Serbo-Croatian editions. An ad for the very famous Zastava 101. At the endless horizon of the Indian Ocean, a meeting of two beauties. It appeals to the idea that Yugoslavs could travel. They could leave their communist country. And they did travel around the world. And this is playing to that idea of, guys on the move, with all sorts of interesting opportunities as they traveled around. But closer to home, here's a domestic shot. Another ad for the same automobile with the statement, "You can feel the power." Right? This is the kind of imagery that Supek and others were complaining about. So it isn't hard to detect in talk like that echoes of critics like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, with their insistence on consumer culture's essential role in maintaining, reinforcing the capitalist, specifically capitalist economic order. And it's clear that these critics thought that Yugoslav business had managed to build something very much like the culture industry that those Frankfurt School critics talked about and hated so much. But as regards the history of socialism, I would contend that the most significant criticism that emerged from within the Marxist revisionist circles that we're talking about was the idea that the profound consumerist orientation was a new opiate of the masses, that it had been undertaken deliberately in the interest of social pacification, and perhaps not so obviously in the interest of social discipline as well. The government, in this view, had actively encouraged the wholehearted adoption of a consumerist mindset, and then in the most Machiavellian manner, had used consumption policy as a both carrot and a stick to keep that populace in line and on course. And so we find another left-wing Marxist sociologist complaining, and here I quote, "What is so diabolical about this regime is that they've figured out how to use consumerism for their own ends. You have the entire country wrapped up in a pseudo-bourgeois culture with everybody trying to move up. You give the majority of people what they want and their attention is diverted from politics and other such things." It was quite possible then to interpret the reorientation of socialist society toward consumerism as a deliberate top-down construction. From that perspective, consumer society appears to have been imposed. There was very little that was really democratic about it. And if consumer culture was not, in fact, deliberately created as a tool of social control, it was, in the view of these critics, at least consciously managed to that end. And since we're concerned here today with the way consumer culture generated a lot of controversy, that last point suggests how important it is to recognize that many East Europeans were, by all indications, actually quite happy with the good life of consumer abundance, to the extent they could get it. For this question, I think the sources we can work with are particularly fascinating. There's powerful contemporaneous evidence from socialist times that speaks to the popular enthusiasm for consumerism, something I deal with, give an entire chapter to in the book, and we can talk about in the Q&A. Among ordinary citizens, there's a remarkable embrace, even a celebration of Yugoslavia's remarkable consumer opportunities. The evidence suggests that many of them were indeed loving it. In addition to that, if consumer culture had inspired a backlash among Marxist-minded critics, there was in turn a pushback against those critics that was, I have to say, remarkably frank and assertive for any kind of communist country. There was, in other words, a backlash against the backlash. And in addition to that, what I found is that after the collapse of communism in 1989, it is quite tellingly, the experience of consumption that has become perhaps the single most visible aspect of life under communism that it is now safe to remember with fondness, with warmth, with nostalgia. Either. They weren't as stressed out as people. They had a good life, right? And they said things like, our passports were the best in the world. We could travel to the East and the West. We've got it good here. They understood it to be a specifically Yugoslav deal, not something they experienced as people from Slovenia, people from Croatia, people from more prosperous Vojvodina or the cities. They understood it to be our deal, our bargain, something that our Yugoslav system, our specific Yugoslavia, our circumstances, that's what they gave us. And as long as that was sustainable, it really bolstered the legitimacy of the government, support for self-management socialism, a willingness not to address ethno-national issues in a harsh and confrontational way, to kind of preserve the deal. Once it went away, the social glue dissolved. And it made it possible, I believe, for it to come back on the system, both as a communist system and as a multi-ethnic federation, in a way that exacerbated the fragmentation process.